Hello and welcome back to computer programming. So this video is going to be a little different because it's actually going to run you through the entire program. We're going to be setting up a calculator today that makes use of a lot of the stuff we've been learning about with functions. And I know they can be tricky at the start, passing variables in by value or reference. Is it void or int? Do I have a return statement? What does that all mean? So this also just gives us a chance to kind of practice some of this a little more, to talk about it a little more, and hopefully clear up any confusion that you might have. Now, after we get this program written and set up, you're going to be coming back to it throughout the course, all right? Not right away, but in a few labs, you're going to come back and add more functionality to it. And then a few labs after that, you're going to come back and add some more functionality to it. And then a few labs after that, so on and so forth. So this is going to be with us for the rest of the course, and we're just going to get more and more sophisticated with the features we add to it as we grow in our kind of knowledge of programming. So first things first, let's get the sort of starter code. So you can click on the zip. You can click on open in new window. You can download it. All right. It's going to send it to your downloads folder. We've got right here. Again, you need to unzip it. So I'm going to right click, choose extract all, click extract. All right, and that is going to open it up. So you could just open it right from here, but I like to sort of clean up my mess and get rid of the zip file that I don't need anymore, and then drag this into my computer programming folder to keep everything nice and organized. So inside of here, I've got my project file, and if I double click on that, that'll bring up the actual code, and then we can get started and talk about what's actually happening here. Wait for it. Wait for it. Almost there. Almost there. Success. All right. So what do we have here? All right. There's already quite a bit of code. So let's talk about what that code is, what it does, and so on and so forth. So up top, we have a function declaration. All right, so this is a function that's already been created, and it's called enter a number. All right, and if we scroll down here, enter a number basically just does exactly what it says it does. It lets somebody enter a number, and then it returns whatever number they actually typed in. All right. So when we see that, we can kind of know that, all right, that's all it does. It just lets somebody type in a number. So if we look at our main function here, we've got number 1, number 2, and answer. Those are 3 of our variables. We also have this int again equals 1, and we have this character variable, which again can hold letters, numbers, symbols, but only a single letter, number, or symbol. And then we have this while loop here. Now, a lot of you have been saying, like, is there a way that we can make our programs like go again and again and again without having to restart them every time? All right, so that's what this part is going to allow us to do. All right, a while loop basically says, hey, as long as something is true, keep doing the code inside of here over and over and over and over and over and over again. All right, once this is no longer true, then skip all of the code inside of these braces and continue on with the rest of the program. Now, we don't have a rest of the program, so effectively, when this is no longer true, when again no longer equals 1, then our program is going to end. So if I were to run this really quickly, just so you can see what it does. All right, so it asks me which function I would like to perform. Now, the code hasn't actually been written to do any of this yet, but let's just say I type in an exclamation mark. It's going to say, I don't recognize that operation, and then it's going to say, would you like to do another calculation? So if I type in 1, then the variable again still has the value 1 in it, because again, that's being read into the variable again. So the loop keeps happening. And it would ask me which operation I want to perform. And maybe this time I would type in a subtraction sign. And again, it's not going to recognize it because we haven't set up the code yet. But if I hit 1, I just loop back up to the top and it asks me again. And eventually, let's say I type in a multiplication this time. It's going to say it's not there. If I type in 0, then this while loop is no longer true. Again is no longer equal to 1. So it's going to let the program actually end. All right. And in this way, I don't have to keep restarting it each time. I'm stuck in that loop, and it's going to allow me to do it again and again and again and again until eventually I choose 0, at which point the program will close. All right. So again, this is how we can start putting things in. This is how we can make our programs run again and again and again without having to restart them and hit play every time we want to try a new value. All right, now what actually happens here, we start by saying, what operation would you like to perform? And then we read that into our symbol variable. All right, and then we've got this if else. And this first one says, hey, if the symbol equals a plus sign. So if somebody types in a plus sign, then we're going to say number 1 equals enter a number. All right. Now remember, enter a number is just our little function that goes and asks them for a number, and then we return it, and it's going to get stored in this variable. Right? Number 2 equals enter a number. Again, this is going to make them type it in. It's going to get returned, and then it's going to get stored in number 2. So all this is doing is collecting the 2 numbers that the user presumably wants to add. All right, now we're actually going to add them. And you might be saying to yourself, well, why don't we just do something like, why don't we just do this? Answer equals number 1 plus number 2. And you're right. That is what we should do. That is the easier code to write. But we're practicing setting up functions today. That's the whole purpose of this calculator, is to get practice using and setting up functions. So even though this might not be the most efficient way to do it, we're going to set up a function that adds together these 2 numbers. All right. So we're going to go down here, and we want our function to return a value. We want it to return the answer of adding 2 things together. So because we want it to return a value, it's going to be type int. Right? It also could be type float, but we're going to have our calculator and not worry about decimals right now. So ours is just going to be type int, and we have to give it a name. So I'm going to call this one the add function. I'm going to have a left and a right parenthesis. Now, this function needs to receive 2 inputs. It needs to receive number 1 and number 2. All right, so if I'm going to receive those inputs, I have to set up the parameters so that it can receive that information. Now, I could use totally different names, or I could still use number 1 and number 2. All right, the reason I can use number 1 and number 2 is we talked about this, but variables have scope. So the number 1 and number 2 up here are distinct from the number 1 and number 2 down here. Right? They only exist in the function that you created them. All right, so they are set up for 2 parameters. I can hit enter. I can make my curly braces here. And there's all sorts of ways I could write this. And we'll write each one a slightly different way so that you can see the different options. But I could make a new variable. I could say int answer. And again, even though I have an answer up here, it's distinct from the answer down here because of that scope issue. I could then say answer equals number 1 plus number 2. And then I could return answer. Okay, and that will send the result back up to the main function. So anytime I call this function, eventually the result will get plugged in for that call. All right, so if I go back up top here, I'm going to say, after they've entered the two numbers, I'm going to use my add function, and I'm going to send it number 1 and number 2. Now notice no ints here, all right? The ints are down here because this is like you're actually creating two new variables, all right? So this is me creating two new variables that I can then use inside of this function. Up here, I'm not creating variables. I'm just sending it this information that's stored in here, and I'm sending it the information that's stored in here. Now, if I were to leave this by itself, the number would get returned and then it would totally disappear, which doesn't really help us much. So when that number returns, I need to do something with it, all right? And what I'm going to do with it is I'm going to save it inside of my answer variable that I created up top here, all right? So it's taking that result, the result gets returned, and then I'm storing that returned value inside of my variable answer. And then this cout statement here handles the actual output. So if I were to run this, it would give me an error. Why would it give me an error? Because I forgot to copy and paste this up top. So I'm going to take this, my function declaration, I'm going to add it to this right here, and then I'm going to add my semicolon at the end. All right. Now if I were to run this, and I choose the plus sign as my operation that I want to perform, I hit enter. What's actually happening here is I'm calling the enter a number function. All right, I'm going to type in 7. That enter a number function is going to return the value, and that gets stored in my variable. I'm then calling the enter number function a second time. All right, it's going to ask me to enter something. I'm going to type in a number. It's going to return it. I then pass both of these into my add function. It returns a value and stores it in answer, and then we print out the result. All right, so that's the first one. Would you like to do another calculation? We're going to say no, and that's going to end our program for right now. So what we're going to do now is we're going to go and we're going to add some more operations. All right, we're going to add subtraction, multiplication, and division. Subtraction and multiplication are going to be just like what we just did. Division is going to be a little different. All right, and you'll see why when we get to that. But to add subtraction, I'm going to hit enter here. So I'm going to put a space between my if and my else here. And then I'm going to type else if symbol equals equals. And then inside of single quotes, so not double quotes, but single quotes, when you're using characters, you use single quotes. I'm going to type the subtraction sign. Then I'm going to hit enter and make my curly braces. Now, the first part of this is exactly the same. We still need people to type in numbers. So we're going to do number 1 equals enter a number, semicolon. We're going to do number 2 equals enter a number, semicolon. And then we're going to have the same thing here. We're going to do answer equals, and now we actually need to write our subtraction function. All right, so let's go down here. Let's make a new function. Again, I'm going to keep it as an integer. So we're going to do int, and then I'm going to call this sub function for subtraction. It still needs 2 inputs. So I'm creating a variable number 1. I'm creating a variable number 2. All right, this is me creating these variables that I can then use inside of my function. View curly braces, and then I'm going to write this one a little differently. I'm going to do the declaration and the calculation all in one step. So I'm going to say int answer equals number 1 minus number 2. All right, so instead of breaking it down into 2 separate lines, I'm just going to do it all as one line. And then once I've done that, I can say return answer. All right, so effectively, these are exactly the same thing. It's just slightly different ways of doing it. Making this a separate line from this or combining it all into one. Now, so I don't forget this, I'm going to copy and paste my declaration up top here. Okay. So now I have this sub function that I can use. I'm going to go down here and I'm going to finish what I was doing. So I'm going to say sub function number 1, comma, number 2. Again, no ints here. These variables were already created. All right, they were already created up here. This is me just sending those values down to be stored in these new variables that I created down here. All right, so now the answer is being stored. Like this is going to return a value. It's going to be stored in the answer variable, and then we're going to print it out. All right, and this is pretty much just formatting things so that they look nice. It's exactly like we have up above, only the addition is being traded out for a subtraction sign. And in fact, if you want to just copy and paste what's above, that would be totally fine as well. So there's answer, and then I'm going to do 2 and else. But that's just formatting the output. All right. Now again, always a good idea. Let's make sure that it works before we go any further. All right. That way, if we made a mistake, it's easier to find our mistake. All right. So this time I'm going to perform subtraction. I'm going to type in my 2 numbers, and it's going to tell me that the answer is -6. So far, so good. And then, no, I don't want to do another calculation. So that'll end my program. So again, we're going to repeat this. Same thing. We're going to do multiplication. So I don't know why I just highlighted all that. Else if symbol equals, and then the multiplication sign. I've got my curly braces. First part's going to be exactly the same. I need them to type in the 2 numbers that we're multiplying. Right, so there's the 2 numbers that we're multiplying. Next, we're going to set up just like we did before. So answer equals. And now I need to actually write my multiplication function. So I'm going to scroll down. I'm going to go int mult function. This one's going to require, again, those same 2 parameters. And I'm going to show you even a third way to do it. This time, I'm not even going to make a variable called answer like I did the first 2 times. I'm just going to say return number 1 times number 2. All right, so you can return a calculation. It doesn't have to be a single variable that you're returning. It can be the result of a calculation. So this is just going to return number 1 times number 2. All right, so all 3 of these, same logic, just slightly different ways of writing it. Whichever way is most comfortable for you right now, that's what I would encourage. All right, so now that I've got this, I can go up top here. I can say answer equals mult function. Number 1, comma, number 2. Again, no ints here because those variables are already created. I can set up my cout statement. And again, if you just want to copy that and change what needs to be changed, that's fine as well. So there's my output. Now, if I were to run this, I would get an error because I haven't put my declaration up top yet. So I still need to take this. I need to copy it. I need to bring it up top here so that it knows that I've actually created this new multiplication function. So now if I were to build and run this, I'm going to perform multiplication this time. I'm going to say 6 times 7, and it's going to tell me that 6 times 7 is 42. All right. So those three, all very similar. Division is going to be the one that's a little different, right? Because with division, we're going to give the answer old school style. So notice we've been using integers, so we don't get to have decimals because we're using integers. Instead, we're going to present the answer as like, oh, 7 divided by 3 is 2 with a remainder of 1. All right, so we're going to give the answer with the remainder. Now, there are two ways we could do this. We could set up one function that does the division. We could set up a second function that does the remainder, and then we could call them both separately. That would be one option. The other option would be to write one function that returns one of the values and uses a reference variable to send back the second value. All right, we're going to take that second option because I want to talk about and review reference variables, right? But either one would work. So let's start with the part that doesn't change. So this part is all the same. We're going to do else if symbol equals division. We still need them to type in two numbers. So number 1 equals enter a number. Number 2 equals enter a number. And if you're wondering why don't we just have them like enter the numbers at the start, there are going to be times when we only need them to enter one number. There's going to be times when we need to enter 3 numbers. It's going to depend on like the different functions that we end up writing. So based on the function, we have to ask for a different amount of numbers. So that's why we're doing it each time the way we are here. And then we're going to say answer equals, and we're going to write our div function. Now, we're going to start just by doing the division part and not worry about the remainder part. We're going to come back to the remainder part in a second. So at the start here, it would be exactly the same. I could say int div function. I could say int number 1, comma, int number 2. So exactly the same as we've been doing. Right? Again, I've got 3 different ways of doing this here. Because there's going to be a little more going on in this one, I'm going to do it the long way just so that we can talk about everything. So I'm going to make a variable called answer. I'm going to say answer equals number 1 divided by number 2. And then I'm going to say return answer. Now, one thing to know about the return statement is the return statement instantly ends the function. So if I were to have code down underneath this, it would never actually get to run because as soon as the program hits a return, it ends. All right. So as soon as the function hits the return, it also ends. So a return kind of ends the function. So that's why in our main, return 0 is always the last thing, that it ends the function. So we are going to be adding some code in between here. We can't add it underneath because if we added it underneath, it would never actually run. It would just get cut off. All right. So let's talk about how we're going to add the remainder here. Because right now we've got the division part. That's exactly the same. We also want to calculate the remainder. All right. So we're going to do that via a reference variable, which means we're going to connect a variable up here to a variable down here so that any changes we make to it down here affect what's going on up here. Now, all our variables are kind of in use, all right? We're using number 1 up here. We're using number 2 up here. Answer is going to receive the division. This is part of our loop. This is part of selecting what you want. So we're going to need a new variable here. So I'm just going to add to our list and create answer 2. All right, because sometimes maybe we need more than one answer with our function. So now we've got a second variable here called answer 2. And this is the variable that's going to be connected to our reference variable down below. So down below, I'm going to add a third parameter to this function. I'm going to call it int. I'm going to put the and sign in front of it so that we know it's a reference variable. And I'm going to call it remainder. All right. It doesn't have to have the same name as my variable up here. All right. What's going to be important is where I place this when I'm calling the function. As long as I put this in the third spot, it's going to be attached to this reference variable here, again, because I used this and sign. All right. And then any changes I make to remainder down in here will automatically affect answer 2 up above. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go here and I'm going to say remainder equals number 1 percent sign number 2. All right, it would help if I spelled remainder correctly. So remainder equals number 1 percent sign number 2. That's going to store the value in remainder, but remainder is going to be connected to answer 2 up top here so that both results will come back. So how do we actually connect it? I'm going to call div function. I'm going to pass in number 1. I'm going to pass in number 2. And I'm going to pass in answer 2. Right, so we can see that this function is going to return the division. And when that division gets returned, it's going to get stored inside of answer. But it's also using this reference variable here. So answer 2 is connected to remainder. So when we do this remainder calculation, it's going to simultaneously change answer 2 up above. And in that way, we'll get both results back. All right, so let's take this. Let's Control C. Let's paste it up top here. And now this one, we're going to have to format the output a little different because there's more to see here. So we're going to say cout endl. That part's going to be the same. It's going to still be number 1 divided by number 2. I've got my equal sign. So again, all this is still the same. The division is inside of answer. So that stays the same. Then I'm going to do a space. I'm going to do the letter R for remainder. I'm going to put a space after the R. And then I'm going to print out answer 2 because that's the variable that I connected to remainder down below. So that's going to have my value in it. And then I'm going to put my endl and endl again, just for formatting purposes. All right. So if I were to run this again, let's see if I made any errors. Oh, we're good. All right, so if I type division and I type, I want to do 7 and let's say 3, it's going to tell me that the answer is 2 with a remainder of 1. All right. And if I do it again, and let's say this time I do something that's 10 and 5, it'll tell me that it's 2 with a remainder of 0. All right, so again, you're seeing that it is working the way that we intended here. All right, both values are being sent back to the main, even though a function can only return one of them. All right, the remainder we're kind of sending in the back door by using these reference variables. All right, so just kind of a quick recap of everything we just did. All right, we have our character symbol, and that's being used as part of this if-else statement to pick which function we actually want to do. All right. Once we select one, we use our enter a number function to get them to type in the numbers that we need. All right. And again, all that's doing is asking them to type in a number and then returning the number. So that's letting them type it in. Then we're saying answer equals, and we're calling a function because this is going to return a value. So when that value gets returned, it will instantly be stored inside of our answer variable, doing the same thing here, doing the same thing here. And then we're outputting our result. So this is just formatting the result and saying like, okay, number 1 plus number 2 equals whatever. All right. Division was the only one that was a little different. All right. We were still returning a value, but we wanted that second answer back. We wanted the remainder back. So we added a third parameter. That third parameter was connected to our remainder variable down here because this was set up as a reference variable, which means that when remainder got changed down in here, answer 2 also got changed up here simultaneously because they're basically sharing the same memory. They both point to the same spot in memory. So this answer got returned the way we did it for all the other ones. And then this answer changed a variable up top because they were pointing to the same memory. All right, that's this whole reference idea. All right, and then again, each of these is a separate function, and we have all our declarations up top here. And then there's also the while loop that allowed us to go again and again and again without having to start our program each time. And as long as it's 1, the program keeps going. And as soon as you type in anything other than 1, it stops. All right. So hopefully this was useful. Again, even though we did the whole program together, I still want you to submit it so that I know that you actually carried through with it. All right. Thank you very much and have a great day. Bye.